Welcome to Herbs in Action, COVID and Beyond, Session 1, Herbal Support for the Lungs with Maria Noel Groves. This session was sponsored by the Herbal Nerd Society in partnership with the Practical Herbalist and Real Herbalism Radio. Also, Mud Paw Design House.
The information provided in this session and this summit is not intended to cure COVID-19 or any other disease. Due to the novel and emerging nature of COVID-19, no herbalist or medical professional can claim to cure or know how to cure this virus. We are not responsible for the healthcare choices you make, including your use of food, herbs, or any other substances for any reason. This information is not intended to diagnose, treat, or otherwise take the place of a doctor's advice. Seek professional medical advice if you suspect you have COVID-19 or other health problem. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed in our summits are those of the speaker alone and are not that of Herbs in Action or the Practical Herbalist. Use this information wisely.
Now I want to welcome Maria Noel Groves of Wintergreen Botanicals. She's a registered herbalist, clinical herbalist, and owner of Wintergreen Botanicals, obviously. She's also author of Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies. Her mission is to educate and empower her students and clients under her guiding belief, good health grows in nature. So welcome, Maria.
Thank you so much for having me. So am I on? Oh, there I am. Hello. I've got multiple screens going right now, so bear with me and everybody can hear me okay. And we're, at least for now, trying to live stream this through my Facebook page on Wintergreen Botanicals until Herbs in Action gets going. But so welcome. Thank you guys very much for having me. I do want to give one kind of additional quick disclaimer, and that is that while I do work with a lot of clients with respiratory conditions in a variety of different ways, one thing I don't have experience with and I'm not working with is COVID. So there might be other folks in this particular program that are working with clients who have COVID, but I am not. So my experience is coming more from working with clients with asthma, COPD, recurrent pneumonia, bronchitis, common respiratory infections. And the hope is that we can also apply this information to other respiratory conditions like COVID that may be emergent, but there's still a lot we don't know there. So I definitely want to give that disclaimer too, because I don't want to present myself as being an expert in something that I'm not. But I do find a lot of the herbs that we're going to discuss very, very, very helpful. And they work with the respiratory system in a lot of ways that modern medicine doesn't. And so they can be used alongside modern medicine. They're certainly not a replacement for emergency medicine. So if somebody can't breathe, then they should go and seek immediate medical attention. But for folks who are just sort of dealing with things at home that are in the mild to moderate state, or potentially who are recuperating from respiratory conditions at home, these herbs might be really, really helpful. So Candace, I'll let you kind of to start us off if you are there, although are you still there and ready to?
Yes, I am still here.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. So I know we have a bunch of questions.
Yes, and thank you so much for asking. So my first question was, what experience do you actually have directly with COVID? Because it's a really challenging, how many people really have it? So you answered that. Thank you. I wanted to ask you a bit about lung opening herbs. That's one of the things I've heard a lot of symptoms about it, closing the lungs and in flus in general. I know you need to open them. So can you talk a little bit about that and what that means?
Yeah. And I don't, as far as what constitutes on a biological level as opening the lungs, it's probably a combination of different mechanisms. But when I talk about lung opening herbs, I am talking about things that are going to help make it easier to get air, perhaps improve oxygen utilization, and just help relieve spasms so that the airways can open more efficiently. And we have a lot of different herbs that do that, and they each have their own energetics and specialties. And so whenever you're working with herbs with any kind of respiratory condition or anything, you want to be thinking critically about what am I seeing presenting in myself right now, and what do the herbs do, and what can I use that seems to work well with that? And so there are a couple different herbs. One is elecampane, and that is one that you can pretty easily grow in the garden. It's somewhat picky about where it pops up, and it'll self-seed, and it may or may not like where you plant it, and so it might die off there, but then pop up somewhere else. But we use the root after the plant is just a couple years old. You can get a pretty good amount of medicine from just one root. It gets to be a pretty large plant very quickly. And it is a very moving, very antimicrobial, very warming remedy. It's very balsamy. It's very bitter. Sometimes you might hear of it being used as a digestive bitter. It's one of our few warming digestive bitters that we have out there. So it definitely has a lot of actions on the digestive system as well as the respiratory system. But we oftentimes use that when we need to get crud out. So if there's a lot of mucus, some of the folks that I've heard of using it for their own personal health have been folks who are dealing with, for example, going off of smoking, and they've just got a lot of crud in their lungs and they want to help move that out and open up their lungs. But you can also use it in infections. So folks who get infections with a lot of mucus buildup, they often find elecampane to be really helpful in those kind of cold, stagnant, mucusy states to help clear that out, expectorate, open up the lungs. And while there is antimicrobial activity, it's not strong enough that it's going to kill off something like COVID, but it still is kind of contribute to that net benefit of helping to fight infections that might be going on in the body. But it's not like a total knock your socks off plant. And none of the plants that I'm going to be talking about today are specifically antimicrobial to the effect that I would expect it to be able to get rid of something as serious as COVID, but it's still really supportive. So it might be useful in a pneumonia protocol or in a flu protocol or in a cold protocol, especially when you do see that cold, stagnant, built up mucus that's stuck and you want to move that out and open. It has a pretty strong flavor. I know David Winston considers it to be one of the worst tasting herbs that exist. I actually don't think it's that bad, but it's certainly not something I'd want to drink as a full cup of tea. It's, bitter, it's balsamy, it's kind of earthy dirt flavor, and it definitely is sort of warming as well. But, there's something I kind of like about it nonetheless. So as a tincture or an herb infused honey or a syrup or some remedy like that, it works well. You can certainly do it as a tea. It's medicinal that way. It's quite helpful that way, but it would be kind of hard to take in that format. Whereas getting it over quickly in a tincture, that's usually how I would personally use it in protocols. And often I am combining elecampane with other herbs that we'll be talking about today. You can certainly use it as a simple or as like a single ingredient. That's what we refer to as a simple, but you don't have to necessarily use it that way. And often I am combining herbs to buffer that energetic. Since it is such a hot, warming energetic, maybe you do want to soothe it a little bit with a little bit of honey or a little bit of marshmallow leaf or something like that to just take the edge off of it. And just to kind of come back on David Winston saying this is the worst tasting, just as an aside, I actually think that saw palmetto berry is probably the worst tasting plant in existence. I think our elecampane is really not so bad. So then, did you have anything to add, Candace?
No, I was going to ask it. It sounds like it would be a good one for like common cold in terms of the antimicrobial, like that level of microbials. It'll be helpful.
Definitely. Yeah, it would be great to consider in common cold. And I'll even use it in chronic support formulas as well for folks with lungs when I see that need for that particular, warming, moving, opening, get the crud out. It's really like, it's like more than just get the crud. It's like kick the crud out kind of herb. And so when that kind of energy is useful, it's a great herb to include. I also probably use it most often in my clients with digestive issues dealing with dysbiosis because it's antimicrobial and digestive stimulant as well. So, moving on to the next herb, this is a very different energetic, even though it's also used to open up the lungs, and that's mullein. And this is an herb that's great because it's something that's popping up in our gardens and in the wild right now. You want to make sure that you've correctly identified it. It does look quite a bit like foxglove, and there have been a few people over the years who have died from what they thought was mullein leaves in a tea and actually was foxglove leaves in a tea. And when they're in their basal rosette, they're both biennial plants, and they both look very similar when they're in their leafy stage. It would be a really deadly mix up to make. So make sure that you know how to identify mullein. And, if you need to, wait until it starts to put up its very distinctive flower stalk and then choose some of the happy leaves off of those. But I'm seeing mullein popping up all around the garden right now. I'm in a zone 4B, so probably in other areas of the country that are warmer, you might already have, little bits of flower stalk starting to pop up. But that's an awesome herb for opening the lungs. It's one of my favorites from that more tonic, gentle, moistening, cooling. So in contrast to where we see cold, stagnant, built up, wet, mucusy that we want, the warming, drying, moving energy of elecampane, mullein, on the other hand, is where we might use where things are hot and irritated and spastic. and we need to cool it, moisten it, soothe it. But then at the same time, it is also antispasmodic. So it also helps relax those spasms so that things kind of open up in the respiratory system. And it's a great thing to use in the moment for spastic, irritated respiratory states, but then also to use on a regular basis. So if you had somebody who had chronic respiratory conditions, especially I could think of like asthma, COPD would be examples. It's not a cure for these things, but it can be really, really supportive for helping improve the health and the vitality of the lungs, soothe that irritation so that people can breathe more deeply. You know, there's an immediate kind of response that you can get a deeper breath, but then long term, it's really supportive as a tonic and healing agent for the respiratory system. And I have heard of some really impressive results, and it's one that I use in most of my respiratory formulas that I might custom blend for clients. There's going to be some mullein tincture or some mullein leaf in the tea. It's got a pretty mild flavor, so it's easy enough to throw in a lot of different formats. You can make syrups with it. So it's just a really, really nice herb that's very commonly available in the wild. You just want to make sure that you've correctly identified it. Also, the hairs that are on mullein leaves, while you'd think they'd be super soft and soothing, it would be kind of a good doctrine of signatures for it, is that it's this nice, soft, fuzzy, flannelly plant. So you think, oh, it's nice and soft and soothing. But actually, the hairs are a little irritating, especially some people are more sensitive to that than others. So when I'm making remedies with it, that one, I want to make sure that I filter through a coffee filter or a tightly woven cloth. Just my metal strainers are usually not quite enough for that. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're going through things and, straining it out a little bit more than you might strain all your other respiratory herbs. To me, that's a little inconvenient because usually when I'm making teas, I'm doing them in little stainless steel strainers, and that might not be enough to get those hairs out of there. But just as an example of one of the situations where I had a formula for a client, so it wasn't just mullein, but that was one of the key herbs in both a tincture blend and a tea. And oftentimes I do like to double dip, or maybe people do two different types of remedies at once. She had been working in a basement that had had a lot of water damage and was pulling out fiberglass that was moldy, and then was finding that in her training for a big swim that she couldn't get air, that her husband was having to like fish her out of the water and bring her into the boat because she couldn't breathe while she was swimming. And this was a pretty concerning situation, and one that I wasn't quite sure if herbs were going to be sufficient to help her out. But mullein in combination with other herbs really was very helpful in helping her clear out whatever was irritating her lungs, soothe that irritation. And then she continued to use it in her running. After that, she would drink the tea before she would go for a run because she felt like she had better respiratory capacity during her run. So that gives you a little bit of a feel for mullein as an herb. So it's one I would consider in the moment, but I would also definitely consider it long-term tonic if there are chronic respiratory situations or a chronic you have to recuperate from a respiratory state, then this would definitely be an herb that I would consider for that. And it's just a classic, pretty easily accessible herb. The next one is a little bit more specific to a region. I fell in love with it when I was going to school at the Southwest School of Botanical Medicine, and I do purchase it on the international herb market and use it a little bit in my apothecary, but I hear that there are some concerns over sustainability, so I am using it a little less, and that is yerba santa. And that has a long history of use in Native American medicine over in the Southwest and over towards like Southern California, that area, and also had a little bit of use by herbal doctors in the United States in that kind of early America time period, early settler America time period. And it's been used for things like bronchitis, emphysema, asthma. It's another one that is a little bit moving. It's a little bit drying. It's got a kind of pleasant cherry eucalyptus-y flavor, and they would use it to cover up more bitter flavors like golden seals, berberine, bitterness. They would use yerba santa in that. There's actually a chemical reaction between some of the constituents that makes it a little bit more palatable. I don't personally use it that way. There's just a little bit of its history. But yerba santa is a great herb to consider as well, where there's tightness, mucus, and where it's just hard to get a deep breath. And it's a pretty pleasant, for the most part, flavor to add to a tea or add to a syrup or add to an herbal honey or add to a tincture. I personally mostly use it in tincture format, but you can use it in other formats too. And it's very resinous in its properties, so that does make it pretty alcohol soluble. And there does seem to be a little bit of evidence that it might even have some immunomodulatory action. So for folks who have respiratory conditions that are tied to allergic, autoimmune type states. So asthma would be a potential example of that. Yerba Santa might be really uniquely special for helping support that and helping to heal that situation. And there's a really nice, if somebody's really good at digging around and you happen to be an an American Herbalist Guild member, if you can dig around some of the old Journal of the American Herbalist Guild issues, there's an article by Francis Brinker that's pretty cool that looks into a lot of the traditional use and the early eclectic physiomedicalist doctor uses of yerba santa to make it pretty impressive. So it is one that I occasionally use, although I'd say mullein and elecampane are my biggies, especially since those are things I can personally harvest in my backyard or easily get from local herb farms, and I get it both ways. And then last but not least is lobelia, and this is one that I have actually been reading from folks on groups, Facebook groups, and those kind of things, folks who are dealing with COVID who have found lobelia really useful, but it's also a plant that is generally considered a practitioner-only plant, and that's because it is a pretty strong, kind of drug-like plant. It's definitely a low-dose plant. You only need usually a couple drops, like not dropperfuls, but just drops, and it's very accurate. It'll kind of burn the back of your throat. The other concern about lobelia is that it is a pretty small plant and kind of limited. It's widespread, but it doesn't tend to grow in really abundant quantities. And so there are some sustainability concerns if everybody went out harvesting, gobs and big jars of lobelia tincture. Also, the good news is you don't need a big jar because you're just using a couple drops at a time. It is a bit of a relaxant. It helps soothe spasms. It has a lot of pretty profound effects on the nervous system. There are a lot of potential for herb drug interactions that we just don't really know too much about. But what it does is it seems to go in and really just ease those spasms and open up the lungs, relax tension, both physical, emotional, and also respiratory tension, and just ease that up so that people can get a better breath and also help move out crud and expectorate. As a little bit of tradition of use, although it's controversial for helping with folks who are trying to quit smoking, because it may help ease cravings as well as help open up the lungs and clear out crud. But it's one for those folks who do tend to form a relationship with lobelia around their respiratory asthma and other states. They really, really love it because they get a lot of relief from those few drops to open up the lungs. And if you were thinking about using it, it's not actually that hard to cultivate. I purchased a plant through the mail from Companion Plants a couple years ago. And this time of year is great for ordering plants through the mail if you can't get it from a local source, because they can survive the travel. It's usually not too hot or not too cold across the country in May. And I planted it a couple years ago. And then last year I had so much, it had self-seeded itself all over the garden. And that probably should have been a little bit of a warning that what might be coming if you go by the point of view that the plants come because you're going to need them soon. Maybe I should have taken that as a hint that my garden was overrun with lobelia, but it will, pick and choose where it wants to be and how long it sticks around, but it will self-seed. And so you could cultivate it relatively easily in a garden as long as it's, just the right ecosystem for it. But I would be cautious with it. It's not one that you're generally going to see sold commercially. It's usually taken as a tincture or possibly a vinegar extract. Ideally, I'm from the school of using it as a fresh extract, usually harvested in the fall when it's starting to go to seed, and using the whole plant. And but there are other points of view on using lobelia. So I would not just sort of recommend this to somebody who's brand new to herbalism. Maybe you might want to work with an herbalist and they might be able to hook you up and give you customized advice for you and be able to supervise you to make sure that you're using it appropriately. But it is a really amazing herb to consider for opening up the lungs.
So I have a question for you about lobelia.
Yeah.
There's a lot of varieties of lobelia available, like at a lot of garden nurseries. Any lobelia, or is there a specific one that you would recommend?
Oh, that's a great question. So unfortunately, it's really just lobelia inflata, which is one of the wilder species, and it's pretty small and dainty. So one of the things that we don't have on the website right now, but I will send it to Candace after my talk, and then probably might not get up on the website until after the weekend. But I'll also post a link to it in this particular video on my page later on too. But I have slides from my lung class that I do, and that way you can also see pictures of a lot of these plants. And we'll also get that on the Herbs in Action site. So I'll get that to you. But lobelia inflata specifically is the only species that's used. And for the most part, Lobelia, it's just the one species. Yerba Santa, there are a couple different species that can be used, although it's the Californica, that species that tends to be most commonly used. Mullein, we're usually using Verbascum thapsus, but there are a couple other mullein species that look really similar that can also be used, like the Greek mullein, which some people grow because it has this big candelabra of flowers, and you can use the leaves of that. And then there's, I think it's called densiflora, which is another species that has the candelabra of flower stalks, and you can use the leaves of that too. I often see those in commerce, probably because they get mixed up and they're all kind of part of it, but they're all useful. And then with elecampane, it's usually just the one species of elecampane that tends to be used.
Great, thank you. And then there was one question about elecampane that Bettina had about the energetics of it. She asked, is it more neutral or is it more warming?
It's definitely, so elecampane is definitely a warming energetic. So, we have some pretty strong energetics of elecampane being warming, mullein being kind of moistening, cooling, yerba santa being a little bit warming and very drying, and lobelia being very acrid, which is kind of like a warming energetic, but also a relaxing energetic.
Great, that helps. What else can you use? Because like right now, there's so many people trying to get herbs, and it's so, with businesses shut down and all of that, availability isn't always there. Do we have stuff that we could like pull out of our gardens or kitchen cabinets?
Yeah, there are so many respiratory herbs. Like, I love teaching lung herb classes because you're like, look, all of this is the lung herb. Open up your spice cabinet. All of these are lung herbs. A lot of our digestive and our respiratory herbs overlap, and a lot of them also have some immune activity as well. So, pretty much you could probably open up your spice cabinet and throw whatever you have in there into a tea or into a broth, and it would have some antimicrobial, moving, opening, maybe also antispasmodic actions. But specifically, we're looking at a lot of the aromatic plants, a lot of our spices, a lot of the things that are in the parsley family seeds like fennel and cumin and coriander, as well as our mint family herbs like oregano, thyme. Bee balm is one of our cultivated plants that I love to use medicinally because it's so much bigger than oregano or thyme in it, but it's actually like a medicinal combo of the two. You get a lot of the antimicrobial essential oils of oregano and the antimicrobial essential oils of thyme in this one plant, bee balm, and it's huge and it's beautiful, and you just harvest it before it goes to powdery mildew, and you can make so many different kinds of medicine with it. But if you don't have bee balm in your garden already, you can certainly work with oregano, thyme, savory, rosemary, eucalyptus, usually more as an inhaled remedy for the eucalyptus. And you can use essential oils too, but usually with the essential oils, I would just use them diluted in a diffuser or in a steam, but I don't personally like to use essential oils internally. And I know Erica's going to talk a lot more about aromatics and essential oils, but those are all really great considerations. I have this big list, so I'll kind of make sure I hit some of them. If you happen to have white pine in your backyard, I am surrounded by white pines. It's a really common tree in this neck of the woods here in New Hampshire, and throughout the country. You get a lot of different evergreens. Not all evergreens, but a lot of them are used medicinally, and especially you generally see it amongst the pines, the spruces, hemlock tree, which is not the same as poison hemlock, but hemlock tree, Tsuga canadensis is the species that we have out here. There are a couple others, like I believe, I'm not in Douglas fir territory, but I think you can use some of the needles. So we're using the needles of these specific evergreens, and they're all in the pine family of evergreens, white pine being one of the most favorite ones. I don't know if I mentioned firs, but they're definitely one of them too, especially balsam fir. And they tend to be very antimicrobial, moving, a little bit of antihistamine action that you also get from the evergreens that you don't get as much from some of these other aromatic antimicrobials. So those would be great to throw into teas, syrups, infused honeys, all sorts of different tinctures. They tincture wonderfully. I usually do them fresh, but you can also do them dry. So those are great remedies to consider. And often people can just go out in their backyard or in nearby woods and go and clip some of those new needles and throw them into a tea or a steam or something like that. Just again, always make sure that you've properly identified your plants. There are some other types of evergreens that are toxic or inappropriate to consume. So do your research ahead of time. And peppermint, another one that a lot of people have just kind of hanging around their tea cabinet, or maybe they're growing it in their garden. And peppermint, while it's not quite as antimicrobial as some of the other herbs are, it's a fantastic antispasmodic. It is the key ingredient in Ricola cough drops, which are one of my favorite cough drops, for helping to ease those spasms and soothe the throat and all of that good stuff. So, just wonderful, wonderful remedy for coughs and spasms, and when you just need to kind of open up the lungs a little bit. Not everybody's digestive system can handle peppermint. It's a pretty strong herb, but it's one of our options. Rosemary, a lot of folks I've been hearing have really good luck using just rosemary as a tea or rosemary infused in a broth. And these are all herbs that tend to be a little bit warming. They are antimicrobial. Again, they're not going to cure COVID by any means, but they might just help contribute to just make it a little tougher for microbes to kick around the respiratory system. So they're still going to help be supportive, but they're not cures in and of themselves. But those are great. They are very warming, and by their very nature, they're often expectorant, which is going to help break up and move some mucus out. And oftentimes they're help as an antispasmodic to open up the lungs. Garlic, onion, ginger, those are also all great. Again, generally very warming in nature. And usually, if you do want to kind of soften the edge of them a little bit, combining them with a little bit of honey can be nice. Or we're going to get into some of the more demulcent herbs in a moment. And I do love to combine those with some of these stronger herbs to just help take the edge off of them. Because you definitely want to think about energetics as a whole. Like, am I hot? If things are really hot and dry and irritated, then maybe I want something soothing and cooling and moistening, or vice versa. But that doesn't mean you couldn't ever use an herb that maybe didn't quite, maybe was also warming, but you were already kind of warm. But what you might do is you might balance it in a formula with other herbs that are cooling. Or even if you were dealing with, cold, wet, mucusy things, and you're going to use a lot of these warming herbs. If you just have one formula that's like all really hot, spicy, moving herbs, that's kind of a lot for the body. It's not really very nicely packaged. So you might throw a little bit of something that's a little bit more soothing and softening in its energy to just take the edge off of those other herbs. And the demulcents are one of my favorite categories for that, like marshmallow and plantain leaf and violet leaves are all good options. And even honey, as long as you're not getting so much sugar that it's bad for your immune system, honey can be a nice way to soothe and take the edge off. And you'll notice that a lot of these herbs are traditionally combined in either a syrup, sugar, or honey base when we're using them for the respiratory system. So you might be using a cough drop, or you might be using honey sweetened tea, or you might be using a syrup in these formats. And it just kind of helps balance them a little bit, and also, of course, makes them more palatable. And honey has its own benefits for coughs and the immune system as well, but it's still sugar, so everything in balance. I have a tea that I like to make. It's a lung support tea, especially when folks are dealing with infections and just kind of like cold, stagnant crud. And bee balm and Korean licorice mint and peppermint are the three main herbs in that blend. And those are all really flavorful herbs. You get like an oregano-y flavor. Korean licorice mint is closely related to anise hyssop. I like the taste better. It's a little harder to find. It's got a little bit of a fennel flavor, so you could use fennel seeds if you didn't have Korean licorice mint or anise hyssop. And so you get this like sweet licoricey, you get this, peppermint, and then you get this oregano-y flavor, and they actually combine pretty well, but it's a lot of, it's just very moving. And so what I do to soften that is I'll add plantain leaves and marshmallow leaves. And that just really just kind of balances out the formula quite nicely, gives it a little bit of a soothing edge to go with all that antimicrobial, antispasmodic. And that's a tea blend that I'll use if I'm coming down with something, just a regular cold or flu. I will, usually it's a cold for me because I don't usually get the flu, knock on wood. And I'll make a tea, and then as it's steeping, I just kind of tent myself over it and inhale it and use it as a steam. And then I'll drink it as a tea and get the benefits internally as well as a steam. And a lot of these sort of aromatic herbs make excellent steams. That's a great way to help move mucus and get things going. And oftentimes people might use that combo of like, all right, I'm going to do a steam first, or maybe even just take a hot shower and then throw a couple drops of peppermint oil on the floor of the shower and get that steam and the essential oils in there, whether the essential oils are coming from the plants, as you're over your bowl of herbs, or from essential oils that you've diluted in hot water. It just helps kind of open things up, move things out. And then you might find that it's easier to, cough it out or blow your nose and get it out, or wherever it's coming from, you might find that it's easier to expectorate out after you've done that steam with those aromatics, and then the hot, just having hot steam is good, but then having their aromatic herbs in that steam makes it even better. So those are all some options that you can think of that are usually you'll have at least some of those around, or you can go buy them at the grocery store, or you can plunk them out of your garden.
Nice. Well, if you have, there's like a whole bunch of different varieties of bee balm. Is it
Hmm.
really just like the fistulosa one with the pink flowers, or is it many types?
Yeah, the fistulosa is definitely my favorite of the bee balm species, but any bee balm that sort of has a nice pungent, it's almost like hot when you bite into the leaf. You'll notice it kind of tingles. It actually feels very warming. But any of them that have a good flavor, oregano-y, thymy, and the more bite it has, the stronger it will be. And as far as an antimicrobial, aromatic, moving, warming kind of agent. But you can definitely use other types of bee balm as well. It's not just the fistulosa, but that tends to be one of the strongest ones.
Lovely. So those are pretty warming. Can you tell me more about the demulcent herbs? A little bit more about?
Yeah, I love demulcents. Also, I'm somebody, a lot of these herbs work for the digestive system as well as the respiratory system. There's a lot of affinity, we have mucosal membranes in both of those places. And so I'm somebody who tends to have a very sensitive stomach. And if I was just to do a lot of these hot, energizing, moving herbs all the time, it would be really hard on my gut. And so I love using the mucilaginous herbs in GI blends, but they're also a great complement in respiratory blends as well. And we would think of them as, front and center for sliming, soothing, moistening, cooling. And so we would use those energetics when somebody is dealing with, hot, irritated, damaged, really dry conditions. Maybe your throat is getting really dry and you might use marshmallow tea or marshmallow gruel or something like that to soothe things. And the same thing in the GI system. We tend to think of it that way. Aloe gel is also something that sometimes might be used as a demulcent and mucilaginous herb. But I'd say marshmallow is by far my favorite because it's usually pretty easy to get. It's pretty easy to cultivate. It's very sustainably harvested. And I grow it in my garden, and I love using the leaves in particular. You can definitely use the root, and I buy the root and use it. I think it's out of stock everywhere now because everybody's buying herbs everywhere now. But the root is a little bit more slimy, but I actually like that the leaves are a little bit mucilaginous, but not like this. I mean, if you take marshmallow powder and you mix it in water, it becomes the consistency of snot. And so that can be nice if you're really, really, really dry and irritated and you just need to coat everything. But if you're in a respiratory state and you just want a little bit of softness to a little bit of soothing for your blend, marshmallow leaves are awesome. And they're something you can easily cultivate large quantities in your garden. And they're probably still available in commerce, especially if you go around to the different herb farms. And I just feel like they're a little underutilized as a source of mucilage, even though they're not quite as like heavy duty. But, in herbs, it's not always about getting the most, the biggest, best, strongest in a particular category. Sometimes those herbs that are a little bit more gentle and a little bit more supportive can be really, really nice to think of as well. We don't always want to like kick and push or soothe and, slime and muck things up a little bit. So, so we're going to use these for dry coughs, irritated coughs, spastic coughs, and sore throats, and those kinds of things would be where you might want to consider throwing some of the mucilage into the mix. They're generally not antimicrobial. So if you wanted that energy in your blend, you'd want to throw additional herbs into it to get a little bit of that in there. But they are a great thing to consider as the backbone of a formula, especially they're very soluble in water. So using them in tea format is usually nice, or you could use them in a lozenge, or you could use them in broth, or let's see what else. I'm sure I'm missing a few things. Usually not tincture. So mucilage does not extract well in alcohol. And so while I might use all the other ones we're talking about in tincture format, when I want to go to the demulcents and the mucilaginous herbs, that's when I don't tend to use tinctures. I tend to go for teas and broths and gruels and, food ways of getting it in, especially in water bases, tend to work best. And some people get kind of obsessed with using them in a cold water extract because you do get a more pure mucilage extract when you do it in cold water. You don't get much else that's in the plant except for that mucilage. But I've done experiments where I've started in hot water or cold water. It really doesn't seem to make that big of a difference. I'd have no problem simmering it. You do potentially break down the bonds a little bit of that mucilage, kind of like with broth. If you ever make a really gelatinous broth and then you warm it up, it becomes liquid, but it's still good for you. So I really don't worry too much about whether it's hot water, cold water. It is nice if it steeps for a longer period of time. You will get more mucilage out of it with that longer steep than a shorter steep. But really whatever, however you get it in, I think is nice. I wouldn't get too obsessed with like, this is the only way, except that if you throw it in just alcohol, that's not going to extract it. So you're not going to get your mucilage that way. If you were in a pinch and you needed something that you could just get out of your kitchen, there is a sort of mucilaginous quality to oatmeal, and sugar, of course, is very kind of like soothing, and then honey as well. But they are also kind of quote unquote mucus producing ish kinds of foods. So, and because of their sugar content, they could dampen the immune system response. So you might use them to kind of take the edge off things, but I wouldn't go too, full force with those. I think you can do a lot more with marshmallow. Slippery elm is really popular. I don't tend to use it because of sustainability reasons, but that one is one that sometimes people might happen to have a little bit of it kicking around their apothecary already. And then things that are not quite as like slime mucilage, but are still sort of soothing and velvety would be licorice. Licorice is a pretty dynamic plant. It does a lot of different things. It can actually be really helpful in a lot of respiratory conditions and occasionally inappropriate for some people. But licorice does have a demulcent, soothing quality to it. Plantain leaf has a lot of different properties, but it's generally really safe and well tolerated. So I'll oftentimes use plantain in tea format. You could tincture it. It's a little bit potentially of a biofilm buster. That's just based off really preliminary research. But what we have a long history of using mullein for is as a soothing, healing vulnerary. Vulnerary means that it helps heal tissues. And it's interesting that in the lungs, it makes sense when you're taking these things for the digestive system because these herbs are coming directly in contact with those mucous membranes. You're like, yeah, it's really like having its effect there. Its effect on the respiratory system is often very similar, but it's not coming in. These herbs are not coming into direct contact unless you do it as a steam. Usually if you drink a cup of tea, like it's not going to come into contact directly with your lungs, but yet it still seems to have this effect throughout the body where it has a similar action, even though it's not having direct contact action. And so plantain leaf is very soothing, very healing, a little bit demulcent, but also a little bit astringent. So a little bit tightening and toning alongside the soothing property. So I love adding plantain leaves to tea blends and respiratory formulas and gut formulas. And then violet leaves, probably even a little bit more mucilaginous in my point of view, at least, than the plantain leaves. And those pop up in the garden. I usually will get violet leaves from my garden or from a local organic herb grower because I find that a lot of the violet leaves that are on the international herbal market tend to be just brown dust for whatever reason. And you can still use it, but it's just not quite as nice. But right now, violet leaves are popping up everywhere here in New England. And so you can just go and harvest them. You can actually make tea with them fresh, but it's even better if you dry them and then make them in tea. And they add this really nice velvety quality to the tea, much like a marshmallow leaf would. And violet leaves, in addition, also have some lymphatic moving, which also is supportive for the immune system, help kind of clear out battle debris of fighting infections in the immune system as well. So there are a lot of neat things to violet leaves. And so I'm going to bring up Jim McDonald for a moment. He's a really awesome herbalist, and he has a great monograph on violet leaves if you want to learn more about violet leaves. He's also a big fan of plantain leaf. But if you go on Rosalie de la Foret's website and then you can just Google Jim McDonald violet monograph Rosalie, and you'll find it pretty easily. But you will fall in love with violet leaves after reading that particular monograph. And then another kind of nod to Jim is his thought for why we can drink some of these herbs and still have the effects on the mucosal membranes on the respiratory system, even though they're not coming into contact, is that, the suspicion is that there's this sort of reflex. So as the digestive system responds in one way to those mucosal membrane actions, that ignites a similar response in mucosal membranes, other places in your body, even if it's not having direct contact. We don't know this for sure. This is like herbal theorizing, but if it helps you understand that action a little bit more, then that's one way you can think about it.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. But I don't know. I mean, mucus, most of the time when we're sick, we don't really want to have mucus. We're like, get the snot out. Can you talk a little bit about the actual, like, what mucus is really doing for us and how we would balance it and why we'd even want it?
Yeah, mucus is such a funny thing. We actually need mucus, but we need the right balance of mucus. And so, again, we can use herbs and think critically about what's going on in our bodies in the moment, or, what you tend to have as your general rule of thumb in your body to determine what's going to be right for you. But if your mucus is too dry, I mean, the main purpose, there are a couple main points for what mucus is doing. It's protecting, coating, lining, soothing the body so that what cells are beyond it are going to be better protected against viral invaders. So that's one of the reasons, it's one of many reasons why we tend to get more sick in the dry season of, going into fall and winter, because you don't have as much of a mucous membrane, and it becomes really easy for viral invaders to go in and attach, and attack the cells. And if you have a nice mucus layer, that's going to just provide a little bit more of a barrier so that it's a little bit harder for those viruses to get in. And then ideally it's going to help trap them and then move it out. Either you swallow that mucus so that it gets into your stomach, and hopefully you have good stomach acid and it kills microbes there, or you're going to cough it out, or you're going to blow it out through your nose. So one way or another, it's hoping to trap those viral, bacterial, fungal invaders and get them out of the body. But at the same token, if your mucus starts to get too thick, if that immune response to infection starts to get too thick and you've just got lots of mucus going around, now you've created a very cold, damp state, and that becomes very susceptible to becoming very hospitable for bacteria and fungus to just kind of hang out and thrive. So you see that a lot with sinus issues. Folks who have chronic sinus congestion often have, frequent sinus infections, and they're usually bacteria and fungus hanging out in there because it has a chance to thrive. Or, maybe you get a secondary, you start off with a cold or a flu, you've got a lot of mucus floating around, you're not getting healthy right away, and then a bacteria resides, and now you've got bacterial pneumonia as a secondary infection because it's kind of kicking around in there. So that might be related to having too much mucus. And so there's really this like careful balance there. And we can use herbs and their actions to help kind of shift our mucus to either help, expectorate it, clear it, get it out, or to talking too fast here. Or you could be using it to create a temporary coating to create some soothing activity, especially where things are really dry and damaged and irritated, and also encourage the body to then hopefully produce a little bit more of its own mucus layer. So it's really about kind of thinking about what's going on in the system and then using herbs. So those moistening demulcents that we talked about would be really great when things are a little bit dry and you need to kind of soothe and slime and heal a little bit. And they come in varying degrees. So slippery elm and marshmallow root, especially marshmallow root powder and slippery elm powder, those are going to be really, really, really slimy. Whereas if you wanted something that was just a little bit slimy, not too mucusy in a sense, you could go for the marshmallow leaf or the violet leaves or the plantain leaves that are not, they've got that demulcent quality, but they're not so mucilage rich. And so you've got that variation as well. But then maybe you want to dry things out. Then you might be turning to some of those expectorant, moving, antimicrobial aromatic herbs that we were talking about, like the things from the spice cabinet and the things that you might make a lot of your aromatic flavorful teas from. Those will help kind of break up the mucus, expectorate it, kind of dry things out in that kind of way. And that can be useful where there's excessive amounts of mucus or it's feeling kind of stuck in a way. Steams can be an excellent way to help break up mucus, and steams are kind of neat because they do a little bit of both. They are moistening. So if you're really dry, steams feel good just because they're going in and kind of like moistening up those mucous membranes. But then at the same time, they're helping to get mucus flowing so that you can get, stuck mucus out more effectively. Steams are just, one of those really simple things that we forget about sometimes that we can use when we're not feeling so well. We also have a lot of herbs that are going to work more from kind of like a histamine mucus kind of perspective. We don't always know exactly how they work, but these are the herbs that we tend to use for supporting allergies to help make us more or less allergic in seasonal allergy season. And so Nettle is one of the biggies. And while you could certainly try using nettle leaf tea, a lot of people will use that and find it to be somewhat helpful. What really tends to work better is using fresh nettle leaves in some sort of fresh extract. So you could juice it and freeze it. You could you can use freeze dried capsules. That's what's been studied in some of the research. But what I tend to use is I'll do a fresh plant tincture with alcohol, high proof alcohol. You could probably do quite nicely with a vinegar extract as well. I haven't used it, so I can't speak to it, but vinegar usually does a pretty good job extracting. And then, of course, you get the minerals in that vinegar extract too. But nettle seems to have some antihistamine, some immune modulating activity, and it's definitely better when you're working with the fresh leaves versus the dried leaves. And sometimes you notice an immediate relief in that allergic response, sometimes even within minutes. And that was something I learned from one of my local herbalists, Debbie Mercier, up at Greenwood Herbals in Maine. And some of her students were raving about it. And I had not really been that impressed with nettle for allergies until they were like, no, use the fresh plant tincture. And now it's something that I use quite widely in my practice when I'm working with clients with allergies. And I really do see a lot of support for using that. And so that can help from just kind of, in a sense, drying, but more because it's reducing that histamine mucus response. And it is diuretic, more so when you're using it as a tea than as a tincture, but it is a little bit diuretic. So you might notice that you're peeing more. It's a fluid mover. A lot of these antihistamine herbs are a little bit of fluid movers. So they often are diuretic as well as sort of more antihistamine for the respiratory system as well. Do make sure you know how to properly identify nettle. Unfortunately, most of the things you might confuse for it aren't actually toxic, like the case with mullein and foxglove, but there are a lot of mint family plants that look a lot like nettle, plus a couple other plants that are out there. So, just make sure that you know what you're going, because you're usually harvesting the spring leaves, and those are going to be harder to identify versus once it flowers and it becomes more distinctive. Another herb to consider that's also kind of a common weed that's really great for allergies and the histamine side of mucus would be goldenrod. And goldenrod is a wonderful mucus mover. I had a cold from hell years ago that just really, it turned into a sinus infection. I'm usually a sore throat person, sometimes a chest congestion, but I almost never get it in my sinuses. And this particular cold that just really stuck around and got into my sinuses and turned into a bacterial infection there. I became very sympathetic for the sinus people, because that was more miserable than a sore throat by far. And so what ultimately ended up clearing it out, and I was throwing so many things at it, and nothing was touching this infection at all. And ultimately I ended up using a combination of goldenrod and bee balm, and very quickly it helped move things out. And I was really pleased to see that. And I had talked to my doctor, so I had a prescription for antibiotics if I felt like it wasn't going away. But she was like, these things probably clear up on their own within a few days. So, wait. And then if it really gets bad or it's not going away, go ahead and fill it. And I really didn't want to use my antibiotic prescription if I didn't have to. And I didn't end up needing to. I will say I also used cayenne in a neti pot wash, which is pretty hardcore. Not generally something I do, but it probably helped as well, just for getting everything that was stuck out of there. But goldenrod is really great for mucus to help move things out, help clear it. It seems to thin the mucus a little bit. And I particularly like using the flowering tops just as they're starting to come to flower, and the leaves, and making a tincture with that. You can do tea as well, but I think the tea is going to be a little bit more diuretic and kidney focused, whereas the tincture or perhaps a vinegar would be a little bit more focused on the upper respiratory system. And the bee balm I threw in there because of its more antimicrobial action, and that I was ingesting. I wasn't putting that in my nose. Another herb that I often think of, kind of last but not least, would be horehound. And this is one of my prime herbs that I think of for mucousy states, because it's really great when there's thick, stuck mucus or just copious amounts of mucus. Folks who have allergies or colds and they're getting that post-nasal drip that's just really, really irritating. And horehound also goes, and I love, because it's not dry, it's not just drying the moisture out, which that's not necessarily what you want either. It's helping to thin it so that you can expectorate it and just be in a more normal mucus state. There are other herbs like the berberine rich herbs like golden seal and barberry and Oregon grapefruit, and they're just super drying. You take it and 15 minutes later, you're all your mucous membranes are suddenly really dry, and that's got its place. But to be honest, more often we don't want to just dry it out. We just want to kind of thin it out and expectorate it and get things to be in a more balanced state. And horehound and some of the other herbs like goldenrod are really perfect for that. So usually we think of using it as a cough drop, but I tend to use it once again as a tincture. Horehound is really bitter. I don't know, Candace, I think we've talked about horehound before. Like, this is not an herb you're going to want to drink. You can, it works if you make it as a tea, but it's really better as a tincture. And I usually fresh plant tincture it. If you are going to work with it dry, which you could do, I would seek it out from herb farms directly versus going to the international herb market, because this is another herb that just, or whatever reason, the international herb market is just really weak in its quality. It tends to be a lot of brown dust. So if you can't find a place to wildcraft it or cultivate it yourself, then seek it out from an organic herb grower. And there are a few out there. It's a little bit harder to find, but there are a few out there that are growing it. And it makes a great tincture or syrup or other remedy. But usually, again, I use the tincture of most of these herbs. And another one that I, just kind of thinking of now, but from an allergy perspective, and it'll kind of come in again for the restorative properties, would be reishi mushroom. And I often throw that into my formulas for folks who are dealing with seasonal allergies, because it does seem to help re-regulate the immune system. And then it also has a lot of extra special activities, beyond your usual medicinal mushrooms, where it tends to help with your oxygen utilization. And there's been a little bit of research on even things like anaphylactic peanut allergies, using Chinese medicine formulas that include reishi mushroom as one of the primary ones, and finding that downgraded their immune system response so well. And this is not something I would recommend trying at home, but that it downgraded people's immune system response so well that they were not so deadly reactive to peanuts after using this Chinese herbal formula containing reishi mushroom. So I'm not one to tempt fate, so I don't have my anaphylactic clients using it, but it is something that I'll throw into formula when I'm working with clients who have seasonal respiratory conditions. And it's not a immediate remedy. Generally, it's more of you're taking it on a regular basis for months, and then after a while you're like, oh wait, I didn't need to take a Claritin this season for my allergies. And so that may also be helpful in the broader context of this, because it is also a lung tonic, it's also a restorative tonic, it's also an immunomodulatory tonic, it helps improve oxygen utilization. It's just a really cool, I named my dog after reishi mushroom. I love it so much. It is also, I should warn you before you all go out to try to buy it, because of COVID, it is sold out almost everywhere. So, you might be able to find it in commerce, but it is a little bit more challenging right now because of all the pressure around it. But it is a pretty neat mushroom that's uniquely specific to the immune system and the respiratory system.
Yeah, personally, I love reishi mushroom, and it's one of the ones that I have had hay fever my whole life. And after talking with you and reading your book, and then doing my own research and that sort of thing, I decided to give it a try for a year. So I made tincture, and I did reishi mushroom mixed with shiitake mushroom tincture and usnea tincture. And
nice.
I think it has helped a lot. There were many other things I've done along the way, so I wasn't scientific about it. I was more desperate because allergies are no fun. So I gave it a try, and after about a year, I noticed that my allergy reaction the next season was much less than it had been in past. So, yeah.
Nice. And I do often, in clients who have chronic respiratory things, like the clients who, usually I'm not working with them when they're in acute pneumonia state, although I could certainly be, we could certainly use herbs alongside conventional medicine, but acute pneumonia, like that's a cause for modern medicine right there. But you could be using herbs alongside, but especially in those folks who just, every year around the same time of year, they end up getting pneumonia, supporting them, leading up to that season with mushroom blends in capsule form can be really nice. And I'm not going to name brands because I don't want to get too into that, but I have often, for convenience, recommended or used personally a mushroom blend that's geared towards the immune and respiratory system for folks. And that is also really helpful. In addition to, I also do make a double extraction tincture and use it that way too. And while you're not going to get as much of the polysaccharides in an alcohol extract, you do get a lot of the anti-inflammatory, probably antihistamine like terpenes that are very alcohol soluble in that kind of a tincture format. So most mushrooms I don't tincture, but that is one that I do find useful enough as a tincture.
Nice. Yeah. And, I was going to ask you also about long-term support, because reishi is part of that. What else?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Phyllis is going to talk more about it, so I'm not going to get too in depth, but I do think herbs play a pretty cool role where we really don't have we have palliative, certainly if somebody needs an inhaler to breathe, then that's, go ahead and use your inhaler. But we don't have a lot of remedies in modern medicine that actually like help the body heal and help the body, kind of create its own state of balance again. But we have a lot of herbs that are supportive for that. And so they can be a really great thing to turn to. And so medicinal mushrooms as a general group are great because, as I'm sure many of the people who are listening already know, they're rich in polysaccharides that create an immune challenge to the system, which would sound like it's kind of a bad thing, but usually it's actually beneficial and encourages healthier response of the immune system so that it's less likely to overreact to a allergen or
Ooh. Patrick?
What?
Mine stopped. Come here. I don't know.
help. So listen to your body amongst, more than anything else, always listen to your body and how you respond. But I'd say for most people, mushrooms are usually very useful, even most people with autoimmune diseases and allergies. And they can just be really nice over the long haul to support the immune system so that it's better able to fight infections, but also, helps with the healing process as well. And reishi mushroom is my favorite for the respiratory system as far as opening the lungs, supporting the healing of the lungs, re-regulating that allergic component to things, and just kind of in general, supporting things. And I feel like I'm missing a few other things. I've got little pop-ups saying things are delivered on my screen. Sorry about that. But just, reishi mushroom is really pretty amazing. And it's also an adaptogen. It's also helpful for, at least it seems to be an adaptogen. It's also useful for helping when we're feeling a lot of panic or, I don't know a lot about Chinese medicine, but one of the things that the reishi mushroom is used for is Shen disturbance, when there's a little bit of heart Shen disturbance where you end up having, insomnia, anxiety, restlessness of the spirit. And reishi tends to be somewhat grounding and supportive for that with like just a gentle amount of energy. And so I find that really appropriate and useful for a lot of folks. Some of the other mushrooms that tend to have a particular lung affinity would be maybe chaga, but I'm using chaga personally less and less and like almost not at all. One, because of the sustainability issues around it. It's almost always only wild crafted. If you're working with a fruiting body, it's always wild crafted. And there are concerns with it being dramatically depleted in its wild stands. We definitely see that happening here in northern New Hampshire where it grows. And then two, it's, it might also be a little bit more of an immune stimulant, and that's kind of new conversations happening about whether it might actually be potentially overstimulating to the immune system at times in ways that the other mushrooms are less likely to be. And I have encountered a few people who have found that to be true for themselves personally. I don't know if there's any research on that. And then also, I personally find it really stimulating. Like I can't sleep when I get really irritable when I take chaga, but I'm also unusually sensitive to stimulants in general. I'm just a sensitive person. So for a variety of reasons, I'm using chaga less, but you will often hear that mushroom being recommended as an anti-inflammatory and immune supportive, respiratory supportive remedy. And then another one is cordyceps, which is also a little bit on the stimulating side, more for some people versus others. It really is personal, but that definitely has a oxygen utilization, lung tonic, lung healing tonic property, and probably other ones too. I really like shiitake just because it's more from the sort of generic immune support, but it's one of the more palatable ones and it's relatively inexpensive and easy to get. So that's one where I'll just add the powder to broths as I'm making broths. And I didn't mention before, but just broth is also a very soothing remedy if you're thinking of the demulcent property. Making a really good bone broth would be nice, or just making a veggie broth and making sure there's some healthy fat in that will also be kind of soothing for the mucous membranes, especially in the throat. And you can throw your mushrooms into that broth too. Astragalus is another herb I would definitely think about. And that one, especially if you have folks who don't do well with mushrooms but want similar types of properties, astragalus is great. And like reishi, it does seem to have a lot of particular affinity for the lungs. It's very supportive and healing in the long haul, and also around immune system allergies, histamine conditions. That would be a a herb that I would consider using the root for that. Again, this is another one that's going to be really hard to get right now because it has been sold out in a lot of places because of COVID. So it just sort of is what it is. And then mullein would be one of those long-term tonics that's very specific for the respiratory system. And, you use it in the moment, but it does also have a lot of long-term benefit. So those are definitely a couple that I would think of. And there's so many other things we can do. First and foremost, just resting, giving our body the chance to sleep and rest on a day-to-day basis. Making sure we're well rested will help make us less likely to get sick. They did one study with the common cold, and they took folks, and I wish I could, I don't have the stat in front of me, but I think it was less than 6 or 7 hours of sleep per night. So nothing really crazy versus people who had had more sleep. And they swabbed everybody in the nasal passages with the common cold. And the folks who were more sleep deprived had 3 times more likelihood of actually getting sick from that pathogen than people who had gotten a better night's sleep. So this is just the common cold, but it gives you an idea of how sensitive the immune system is to not getting enough sleep. So making sure you're getting enough sleep all the time. And then when you're sick, giving yourself even more chance to just rest, sleep, and throughout that whole recuperation process. One thing that I've been seeing a lot with colds and flus, but then also around, I've been seeing it through the listservs with folks dealing with COVID, is you have this like back and forth where you feel really cruddy. You're like, all right, I need to rest. I need to do all my herbs and do my broths. And you like just relax and take care. And then a day or two later, you feel better. And you're like, okay, great. I'm going to go run errands and do gardening and do cleaning and this and that. And then people backslide. So, fortunately with stay-at-home orders, there's even less temptation to do too much, but really let yourself recuperate like longer than you think you should. Because when you bounce back too quickly and you don't give your body that full chance to recuperate, you're going to be more likely to have secondary complications and secondary infections than if you just let your body do its thing and heal. Because it's a lot of process fighting viral and bacterial invaders. So give your body that rest time. So diet, some people are really sensitive around dairy, especially if you have chronic respiratory things that happen, a lot of mucus and allergies. A lot of times dairy is a potential trigger underlying. So if you know that you might be one of those people, cutting out dairy 100% might make you a little less susceptible for things getting really mucousy and overwhelmed in your immune system. Air quality, not smoking, not inhaling a lot of smoke are all really great things to consider for supporting your respiratory system as well, before, during, and after being infected with whatever. So I think that's probably, I've been kind of like looking at the clock there. I think we're right about the time we're supposed to be wrapping up and taking questions. So
lovely. I do have a couple of questions. One of them came from Chris from the Herbal Nerd Society. And she asked, she said her sinuses are all out of whack because of allergy season. And she wants to know, is that going to make her more susceptible to flu, colds? I'm going to say COVID as well, although I know we don't have data on COVID specifically, but is that going to make her more susceptible? And what does she do to protect herself?
I don't know statistically if it's going to make her more susceptible to infections to have allergy things, but it's definitely going to make you more susceptible for complications. One thing that we tend to see, for example, in kids who have asthma and allergies, that we see, so if somebody gets one little thing and then it inflames the respiratory system and then something else compounds with it, they just become more likely for things to spiral down and end up in a more extreme state. So I don't know whether or not it's going to make you more susceptible to the virus, but it will make you more likely for a chance for things to spiral. So getting your allergies into a better state of balance is usually a good idea anytime, but especially when you're feeling particularly challenged by other things going around. Well, and also likewise, not being sick with a common cold, you're going to be better able to handle allergy season. Usually allergies kind of have this like bucket effect that as things fill up the bucket, everything just gets a lot worse when it overflows. But if you can keep the bucket a little lower, you're less likely to overflow and end up in a more extreme state.
Yeah, and you mentioned you mentioned inflammatory, inflammation in the lungs. Is there any herbs in particular that tend to be your favorites for anti-inflammatory or foods?
Well, I mean, there is a little bit of evidence around boswellia, which is a resin, but I would be thinking, especially around allergies, I would be thinking, cutting out any problematic foods Sugar in general isn't really good for anybody. Eating a lot of processed carby stuff isn't really good for anybody, but dairy tends to be a trigger for a lot of folks. So cutting that down or out is usually a good idea. Supporting with healthy foods and all that is great. And then herb wise, I would be thinking of your, the nettle, the goldenrod, the horehound, things that help modulate histamine and mucus in the body can be really supportive there as well. And then you could use your lung tonics as appropriate. So if you had a cough, then you might throw in some of those cough herbs like peppermint or fennel seeds or Korean licorice mint or anise hyssop. Or if you had, a sore throat, then you might turn to some of your sore throat herbs in addition. But for the allergy mucus perspective, I would be thinking of those mucusy herbs that we already talked about. And I do have a blog on if you go to the condition section of my blog, I do have a blog on allergy support as well. And we talk about it. There's a longer lecture that you can download or listen to off of the Herbs in Action site. And so that goes into a lot of this a little bit more too.
And then we had a question from Natalie. She asked for what are the best herbs for ongoing good health and general immune support? We are going to be hearing from Phyllis, and we're going to be hearing from Thomas later in the day. And I think Phyllis and Thomas were potentially also going to cover that, but feel free.
Yeah. Well, we just kind of talked about some of those as far as the recuperation phase, but those would also be good preventative support. So looking at things like astragalus, medicinal mushrooms, getting enough rest, being clean with your diet, all those things are really helpful for ensuring a more optimal immune system.
Great.
And the blog was out. It's my Wintergreen Botanicals website that has the blog.
Yeah, I was going to make sure that and there will be links to your blog on the session page as well. I had two questions, as maybe last two that I'm going to give you. They were related, so I'm going to just kind of combine them. One came from the Herbal Nerd Society and one came from the audience. And they're really asking about herbs that are especially good or especially not good for children. And the other one was about elderly people. And I'm going to lump them together because I know they're both groups of folks that have a tendency to be more sensitive.
Yeah, it's hard. We just talked about so many herbs, so it's hard to make blanket statements. I will say that most of the herbs that we have talked about are useful and appropriate in children and adults. I would be careful with licorice because there is a wider risk for hypertension and potentially hormonal effects, which would be a concern for me if you were using it regularly in high doses in kids, although it's unclear how big of a concern that really is. But potentially some drug interactions. So that would be one to be careful of there. Lobelia is a pretty strong herb, so that's one I definitely wouldn't take lightly, and that is more of one that you'd be working with a practitioner to use anyway. Of the lung openers, I would say that mullein is generally the safest, and most of those antimicrobial, aromatic, kitchen herbs that we talked about are usually pretty appropriate for most people. And the medicinal mushrooms, as long as you don't have like a personal mushroom allergy or something like that, is usually pretty well tolerated. Reishi mushroom might have some blood thinning effects. Certainly garlic and onions in large quantities might have some blood thinning effects as well. So that would be a concern from a herb drug interaction. And always, if you're on pharmaceuticals, work with an herbalist or a naturopathic doctor or check with your pharmacist for herb drug interactions. But generally speaking, a lot of the herbs that we've talked about are usually pretty well tolerated by all ages. Flavor wise, kids are not going to want to have elecampane or horehound unless you have a really special kid who is willing to take whatever you give them.
You got to put a lot of honey in that, an awful lot of honey to make that one.
I don't know if there is an amount of honey to cover up the flavors of those herbs.
Well, thank you so very much. I don't see any further questions in the Q&A box. Thank you. And thank you for the technical support at the beginning.
Oh, no problem. I wasn't planning on live streaming it, but if that was helpful, then cool. And I'll, send you the recording, or you probably have a better recording through Zoom anyway, but happy to help. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. And I will be sending a slideshow so you can see pictures of all the herbs that we've talked about to Candace. That will be available probably after the weekend on the Herbs in Action website too.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your summit day.
Thank you.